Hello? Can't hear you. I can't hear you.
Waleed.
Now I can.
Okay.
No, it's gone again.
Waleed, could you take care of these technical aspects kindly, because I have not been able to join.
Actually, none of us can hear Waleed.
Yeah, I can hear everybody else.
Yes, I think there is some problem at Waleed's end. None of us can hear him at the moment. This is Salma.
Hi, Salma.
Hi, Karen. How are you?
Okay, nice to hear you again.
Thank you so much. Such an honor to share the screen with you. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Apologies for technical inconvenience at our end. I hope I'm audible to everyone, the panelists and the attendees.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you, ma'am.
I
Ladies
can
and
hear
gentlemen,
you as well.
thank you, sir. Thank you. So we'll begin now. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's webinar titled Indian Subversive Tactics in Pakistan, the Myth of Ahimsa Exposed, a subject that is extremely important and requires urgent discourse given the release of the dossier on Indian terrorist funding on November the 14th. To speak on India's long-standing history of subversion in Pakistan and the diplomatic and socio-political recourses available to our country moving ahead, we have three distinguished panelists today. A kind reminder before we commence today's proceedings, I would request all participants to please keep sending us their questions on the IPRI host account on the right of your screens. Keep your questions short and precise, and please mention your name and designation along with the questions that you send in. We'll sift through the questions at our end and ask the most relevant ones at the end during the question and answer session. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers for the webinar today. Our first speaker of the webinar is Ms. Karen Joda Fischer. Ms. Fischer is a German political and social activist who was exiled by the BJP regime from Indian-occupied Kashmir in 2016. Our second speaker is Dr. Salma Malik. Dr. Salma Malik serves as an assistant professor at the Department of the Defense and Strategic Studies, Quaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad. Our final speaker is Ambassador Asif Durrani. In addition to various diplomatic assignments, Ambassador Durrani has served as Pakistan's ambassador to the UAE and Iran. He currently works at the Islamabad Policy Research Institute as a senior research fellow. With that said, I would now request Acting President IPRI, Brigadier Rashid Wali Janjua, for his welcoming remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Waleed. Could you unmute my start video?
Absolutely, sir. So you are on unmute. If you could kindly start video at the bottom of your screen, there's an option available.
I'm doing that, but seems like host has disabled it. Okay. Am I audible otherwise?
You are audible, sir.
Yes.
Okay, so you can disable my video, and meanwhile, I can start up. So welcome to all three distinguished panelists, Ambassador Durrani, Dr. Salma, and Carol Fisher. Today's topic is something that has been reverberating in the press and in the media for quite some time. And I start with a quote from Edward Murrow. As per that quote, we are what we are because of our shared experiences. And whatever experiences we have, they shape our attitudes and shapes our thinking. And when we confront the present Indo-Pak reality, the experience is that Pakistan is a country which is beset with an implacable foe, which is bent upon destabilizing it. So that's the warp and woof of our current Indo-Pak reality. In a world where cooperative engagement, economic entanglements, and connectivity is the norm, here's a country which is going in entirely the opposite direction. And the reason is that the strategic congruences and the desire to play a regional surrogate to a global power trumps the economic realities and plunges the entire region into a vortex of instability. Now, I mentioned Edwin Murrow and our shared experience with India. What is that shared experience? It's an experience of a country which is at the receiving end of a destabilizing bout of acts of terrorism, continual hostility, and internal insurrections, which are actively inspired by 87 Indian camps on our borders, 21 of them on one border and eastern and 81 on the western. India has spent something like 22 billion lately to ratchet up an insurgency in the restive province of Balochistan, where there was no insurgency at all. Like the rest of the areas of the world, there were deprivations, there were, development-related problems and issues, but a disparate, motley group of militants like BRA, BLA, and BLF have been cobbled together under the active, planning of Indian Research and Analysis Wing, and a complete new setup has been created under the Indian Prime Minister to fund this effort. Now the world is looking at Afghan peace with bated breath, and we are hoping that Afghans, they get the much needed peace after a decade-long fratricidal insurgency. But the Indian tactics, they run athwart that concept also. Because while the world is engaged in bringing all Afghans together, they're reaching out some consensus, the Indians are playing their own games, trying to destabilize Pakistan from inside the Afghan soil. Now, when that happens, what does that mean? It means that a country which is supposed to be second largest democracy, which touts itself on principles of economic engagement, and once it used to pander to the concept of Ahimsa, now is in the throes of an insidious ideology which is completely hate-filled, which is completely recidivist, which is revanchist, which harks back to atavistic, primeval tribal notions of Hindutva, religion-based extremism. Now, when such a hateful creed drives politics, then the rationality, economic engagement, and diplomatic solutions, they all pale into insignificance. How the world can wean India away from this is the biggest question confronting the international community nowadays. And I'm sure all the three panelists that we have selected would regale us in greater detail upon the underlying reasons and their implications on the regional peace as well as Indo-Pak's future. So with this, I hand it over back to Waleed to start the formal proceedings.
Thank you, sir. Now I invite Ms. Karen Fisher for her remarks. Over to you, Ms. Karen.
Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you perfectly fine, Ms. Karen.
Thank you for asking me to participate on this panel. I feel extremely honored to be here. I'm neither a scholar nor an academic. I also have not worked for a think tank, although I often participate in their events. For the past 12 years or so, I have been a social activist, which makes my language somewhat different from those who are researchers and professors. Almost everything I share anywhere is based on what I have personally lived through and which has made me what I am today. That gives me a very different vocabulary, one that is often more emotional and often quite angry. It would hardly pass as quantitative analysis, with advanced statistics having been the only course I ever flunked in graduate school. For me, tragedy is much more individual, and this is what I usually talk about. Salma has been on a couple of panels with me while I was talking about Kashmir, and she probably remembers this very well. You asked me to talk about Hindu extremism and how it has promoted discord and conflicts in South Asia and affected countries such as Pakistan. I've been trying to wrap myself around this topic for the past 2 days because it is so very broad. But once again, I decided the only way I can put it in some sort of context is by telling some of my own personal observations over the 16 plus years I lived and worked in India and later in Kashmir. I moved to India shortly after 9/11, right after the first bombing of Afghanistan, to be more precise. I had opposed the war on terror and felt it was as good a time as any to say goodbye to the US for good. I decided to move to India because I had been working there off and on for years, and it was a familiar place, or so I thought. Over the years, the same impressions India has been creating about itself in the West had led me to believe that I was going to be safe ideologically from what was unfolding in many other parts of the world. I had fully bought the story of it being a secular democracy based on Gandhian philosophy and meaning no harm to anybody ever, neither friend nor foe. I, of course, knew very little about internal or regional conflicts at the time. I had also blissfully ignored some early signs of Hindutva mobilization amongst the Indian diaspora in the US, raising much money for the BJP. I also ignored having been told by an Indian trade delegation that a brochure we had printed for a US-India Trade Council should not have the color green as its background and be changed to saffron, else we would not find doors open to us in India. Our graphic designer in the US had looked at the Indian flag and selected the color green. It was a huge shock for me upon arrival to find an India that had just dispatched all of its troops towards the border with Pakistan in the wake of the parliament attack, and it looked as though the country was getting ready for war with its neighbor. Shrill patriotic and warmongering frenzy was surrounding me everywhere, and many were hoping India's nuclear arsenal would finally teach Pakistan a lesson. It was impossible to overlook the communal undertones in the ranting and raving. Some journalists at the time were questioning the true intent behind the attack, with a few suggesting privately that it may have been orchestrated by Indian agencies so India could formally join the war on terror. My next experience was traveling to Gujarat while finishing up a customs dispute I had worked on before I left the US. There, I witnessed post-genocidal conditions after communal riots had broken out and thousands were slaughtered by Hindutva zealots with Narendra Modi at the helm. It was very much the way I had always imagined the Kristallnacht in Germany, which of course was the beginning of the Holocaust and the extermination of almost all of Europe's Jews. Something Hindutva zealots and the RSS never tired to describe as the Germans having had the right idea. I don't think many people witnessing the scenes in Gujarat have ever found the right words to describe all or any of it. It was simply too gruesome. I will never forget any of it. And to this day, I will never be able to digest that one of the main architects of the pogrom is the prime minister of a country that is now a strategic partner of the US. This was also the first time that I felt this all-pervasive anger in the streets of India. The anger that gets suppressed for short periods of time, but only to explode at the slightest of trigger, and more often than not ending in communal riots of one sort or another. I witnessed this anger day after day in the neighborhoods I lived in, whether it was directed towards Dalits, Muslims, people from the Northeast, or even animals. Often the anger turned into rape, often committed by gangs of young men, and this is something most foreign and all Indian women fear whenever out at night or moving about in more deserted places. Later, while working on tribal issues in Assam, I saw how the RSS had spread out everywhere, pretending to be social workers while convincing some tribals, who were mostly animists or Buddhists, that they had actually been Hindus all along and had to return to their religious roots before being able to benefit from developmental schemes. That is also when I first saw demographic change systematically planned and implemented by the Indian state and its agencies. In predominantly tribal areas where Schedule 6 of the Constitution had guaranteed tribal autonomy, Hindu Nepalis who had served in the Indian Army and their families were resettled in huge numbers so the districts would no longer meet the demographic thresholds to be considered tribal majority. Of course, throughout Assam and other parts of the Northeast, religious hatred towards Muslims was constantly being stirred up, with all Muslims being portrayed as illegals from Bangladesh, and most recently leading to the segregation of Muslims and others considered foreigners in concentration camps built for those not able to prove their citizenship. Sadly, when protests broke out in Assam over the new citizenship laws, making it possible for undocumented non-Muslims to remain in Assam and other parts of India, while only Muslims cannot, the protesters were not demanding a rollback of the discriminatory law, but wanted it to be even more stringent and cover all groups and not only Muslims. Meanwhile, Hindutva zealots, the RSS, and religious hatred increasingly reigned supreme in a state that used to be proud of its own language, unique culture, and diversity. Obviously, neighboring countries like Myanmar and southwestern China have not been unaffected by the communal frenzy. In fact, India is one of the very few countries never having criticized Myanmar for its treatment of the Rohingya, and instead having begun persecuting as possible terrorists those who had escaped the violence and settled as refugees in places like Jammu. Deeply disturbed by the true nature of the Hindu state in so many different parts of India, I had grown much disenchanted with the country before even moving to Kashmir. There, of course, I lived through 10 years of absolute terror committed on the people by the Indian state, a communalized army, and the military occupation. Most of you know about the atrocities being committed there because they have now been relatively well documented and because Pakistan has been speaking about the human rights violations at every possible forum for years. I could talk for several days about what I witnessed personally and some of the people I knew who have been killed and tortured. All of it has been going on for decades, but for much of the past, having raged as more of a political than a religious dispute. The nature of the dispute changed completely when the BJP under Modi came to power both in Delhi and in IIOJK in 2014. All of a sudden, the rhetoric everywhere had changed and the lives of Kashmiri Muslims were no longer worth preserving. And this is an important point to make. With Modi assuming power, it was not only a government having changed, it was an entire nation becoming fueled by lethal Hindu majoritarian aspirations, almost from one day to the next. It was the ordinary people, like it had been ordinary people in Gujarat, who were now baying for the blood of Kashmiris. It was everywhere, on television, in print editorials, and in the behavior of troops on the streets of Kashmir. Pakistan was no longer just a troubled neighbor, but a place that needed to be defeated once and for all, so that the true Bharat, spanning every nook and corner of the entire subcontinent, could be restored. Kashmiris were attacked throughout India. Muslims were lynched at the mere suspicion of having slaughtered a cow. Hindutva terrorists were released from prison, with some being elected to parliament. It felt like a saffron tidal wave. Jammu, which had already become radicalized and heavily dominated by the RSS since the uprisings of 2008, was now able to openly organize Hindutva flag marches through neighborhoods with Muslim populations. The marchers were fully armed with swords and trishuls. And of course, the history books were being rewritten, describing the Valley of Kashmir as the original abode of Hindus, with Muslims being nothing but an aberration. When a small Muslim nomad girl was abducted and brutally gang raped before being killed, much of the country thought it was a lie and an attempt to smear Hindus of Jammu. Nothing has happened to the killers. All of it finally culminated in the illegal annexation of Kashmir by India in August of 2019, and the abrogation of articles that had guaranteed a measure of autonomy for the Kashmiris, and more importantly, some protections for their religious and ethnic identities. Now we are witnessing the implementation of new land laws aimed to accelerate ethnic flooding by Hindus, and more than likely resulting in Muslims of the region becoming a minority. This, of course, had already been successfully done once by the Maharaja in Jammu in 1947, when his troops and Hindu fanatics slaughtered up to 200,000 of Jammu Muslims and driving out just as many, making it a Hindu majority region. Today, it will be done through administrative action instead of slaughter. With all of this happening, how can Pakistan, a legal stakeholder in the Kashmir dispute, be unaffected and remain uninvolved? Similarly, after unilaterally altering the entire region by turning a former state into union territories, China has already reacted militarily to protect its interests and territory from an expansionist India that feels no longer bound by any bilateral agreements. Moreover, night after night, Indian channels debate the need for India to take over Azad Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan, both of which India claims as its own territory. And the Hindu nation is cheering on a government that promises that it will conquer what belongs to India at the earliest, with defense analysts and generals saying the army is merely waiting for the orders. And now comes the detailed dossier prepared by Pakistan and proving India's sponsorship of terrorist activities inside its country. Anybody having lived in India, and especially Kashmir, and following the aims and activities of Indian agencies throughout the region would never ever doubt any of what has been presented in the report. After years of watching what Indian agencies are capable of in Kashmir, and then blaming it all on its neighbor and its never-ending propaganda war against Pakistan, there's no doubt in my mind that all of it and much more is the absolute truth. Just as an example, I personally came to know about the Indian Territorial Army recruiting local boys in Kashmir for the purposes of exfiltrating them from northern Kashmir into Azad Kashmir to later bring them back as Pakistani terrorists for the purposes of convincing the world of continued state-sponsored terror by Pakistan committed in Kashmir. Lastly, closely watching Ross increasingly supporting RSS and anti-Pakistan linked think tanks and advocacy groups throughout the West, one is only beginning to understand the challenge India's hybrid war represents on every level and the need to strike back where it counts. I personally hope that the accusations will be presented to all international bodies that matter so that India can stand exposed for what it really is and not what it persistently tries to project about itself. I could go on, and of course, most of this is known to everybody on the panel and everybody listening in. I have gone into such detail because I feel the writing has been on the wall for so many years, and what the Modi government has been implementing is just the culmination of everything that had been happening for so many years before and in so many different places. Hindutva was always there from the very beginning. Both what is new is the close marriage of Hindutva extremism with intelligence agencies, and both acting in tandem to create havoc throughout the region. And at the root of it is both the majoritarian and an expansionist philosophy envisioning a South Asia dominated by India and more specifically Hindus. It is a fictional historical claim not dissimilar to that of the Nazis who spoke of creating a Lebensraum for the German race, or the Zionists who used the Bible as the moral justifications for expansion of territory. And nobody seems to care enough again. With all this in mind, I feel the time for trying to strike a balance while speaking about regional tensions is gone. In fact, it seems unconscionable to me when South Asia departments in Washington and elsewhere are trying to do that. There is a right and a wrong, and one has to choose. Watching what is happening in India silently or without intervening is criminally enabling, regardless of what may be happening in the South China Sea. I urge IPRI and others to keep compiling facts and figures for all of us to use wherever we can to present the correct narratives about India to the world. Too much of the history of the region was written by the occupying power and those drunk on Hindutva supremacy fantasies. It needs to be exposed and stopped now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Karen, for sharing the first-hand view, a rather harrowing first-hand view of Indian atrocities, human rights violations, and now since the dossier has been published, or rather released, state-sponsored terrorism. Thank you for your words once again. Dr. Salma, I now invite you to please give your address.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Perfectly audible, ma'am.
Thank you, Walid. Thank you once again, IPRI, for giving me this honor to share this August forum with such learned speakers, to Brigadier Rashid Wali Janjua Sahab for always being so kind. And it is so educating and so fascinating to listen to Karen, that I'm so happy that once again we got this opportunity. And the good thing about these webinars is that minus a visa, minus the travel hassle, you come across such wonderful views. And Karen's view carries a lot of I would say value, because she has seen these things up front and personal, things that we are reading about, things that we are talking about. Karen has actually experienced them in person. And that value has a totally different sentiment altogether. Now, when we're looking at the Indian subversive tactics in Pakistan, whether it's a myth or reality, I would kind of break down this topic into three aspects. One is, what is subversion? Second, is there a difference between strategy and tactic, and how do we make an attempt to define these two basic concepts? And lastly, what exactly are we talking about? Is subversion in this particular case study or context a myth or a reality? So these are dichotomies that we need to look into and we need to examine. And as a result of that, when we kind of take a very, very simplistic Googled definition of subversion, it simply, very, very simply means that it is an attempt either from within or from external elements or some external actor, whether it be a state party, it be insurgents, militants, whatever we would like to term these categories as, but an attempt by these actors to overthrow an existing form of government, either by force or by other unlawful means. Now, interestingly, when we look at this factor, I would underline the two aspects. One is the other, and the other factor here is unlawful. So, what other means that we have? When we say other means, we have a host of options available to us in which one can use any tools, any measures to carry out the required activity or required action. And in that, furthermore, more attempts to look at subversion say that there is an insurrection, a sabotage, using seditious means to carry out these activities of overthrowing a government, of sabotaging a government, of making any country unsuccessful, sabotaging the governance and the framework of a country. But it is always mated with, it is always coupled with malified intent. So the intent to carry out this particular action is something that we need to focus upon. And the intent technically takes us to our second question, and that is, before coming to that, I would also say that in this action of subversion, usually the actors behind subvertive activities would use the individuals, groups, organizations, either from within the country, the target country where these actions need to be undertaken, or its own people, some proxies, to carry out this undesirable action. And the detrimental actions that would ultimately lead to the end goal of overthrowing the regime, or at worst, destabilizing the country to such a status that it is not able to stand on its feet. It becomes a failed state, and it becomes a question mark in the Committee of Nations so far. Now, coming to the second question here, that we were talking about the requisite intent. How do you implement this intent? Is it a strategy or it is a tactic? It is both. Your intent, long-term goals. What is strategy in comparison to tactics? Strategy is a overall action. It's overall game plan to carry out certain activities of whatever you want to achieve, your end goal. And when we look at the tactics simply put are the means, the toolkit available to us at that particular point of time to carry out our desired actions, the game plan that we want to implement. So if strategy is a game plan, if strategy is an overall policy apparatus, it is what we want to achieve, then tactics are primarily the ways and means to achieve our end goal. And here the end goal in this capacity would be creating subvertive activities within Pakistan, destabilizing Pakistan, and doing what it needs to do. Now, how would India carry out these subvertive activities? There are various tools in this particular toolkit that India has in its hand. And one of those toolkits could be the foreign policy. Another could be the economic factors. Third could be using socio-political means, the legal means, media, and so many other things. And the second part of this toolkit is, what is the target audience? And the target audience here could be ranging from the international to the subnational. And I would come to this point slightly later. Lastly, when we talk about the factor that is this entire scenario a myth or reality, then what we see is that there are many things that are happening in real time. But unfortunately, given the situation and given the requirement of the time, and given India's clout that it enjoys in the world fora, the world actors, despite seeing India's being implicit, it being part of what it is doing, its actions, its human rights violations, how it is behaving in the region or around the region. But because India at the moment is enjoying a particular financial clout, it is also enjoying a geostrategic clout vis-a-vis the Western powers and China. So the nuisance value provides India with that comfort zone, with that comfort, and with that clout, with which any of the credible evidence that is provided against India is conveniently either brushed under the carpet or totally dismissed, or no one talks about it. So when we look at the reality of the global system, we may use some very fascinating terminologies such as human rights, such as humane intervention, such as looking at protecting the rights of the vulnerable. There are so many other things that we talk about. But when we try to put them in action, when we try to put them in a realistic prism, we see that many of these valuable, many of these ethical, moralistic terminologies are used only for a certain political currency. And depending on the type of audience that these terminologies are being used for, to gain favorable responses, and nothing more than that. What we have seen is that the American administration, at one particular time, despite getting a Nobel Prize for Peace, used maximum number of drone strikes in South Asia against Pakistani and Afghani targets. But again, this is how the requirement of time is. This is how you try to market or package your commodities and goods and sell them in a very fine and glittery and glamorous package. And interestingly, what we see is that India has no deficit when it comes to glamorous packaging of products. Now, my friend Karen, she has very eloquently told us about what all India has been doing within the state of India, and how it has used this moral garb that it has dawned on itself. And it talks about Ahimsa, Gandhian Ahimsa. It talks about nonviolence. It talks about peaceful coexistence, the Panchila, a terminology that it willfully borrowed from China. And it talks about a smiling Buddha. But when you look deeper into all of these concepts, all of these terminologies, the Buddha smiles again. The first nuclear testing that India does, the peaceful nuclear explosion, where the Buddha smiles, is actually nothing to do with peace. A nuclear explosion, an atomic test, is at the end of the day an atomic test. It brings out radioactivity. It brings out a message round and clear that we have arrived, we have done what we wanted to do, and we have proven that we are part of a nuclear club. Willy-nilly, you accept us or not. We may have missed the benchmark of the NPT, but we have today stricken the chord. Pakistan going nuclear was only a reactive approach. Pakistan being a weaker country, Pakistan being a smaller country, rather than using the term weaker, a smaller country with existential threat loud and clear from India, had to respond in kind. And it took Pakistan a good 23 plus years, rather an entire quarter generation, to respond to India's nuclear attacks. And perhaps Pakistan would not have done what it did in 1998, even if India had not carried out a second round of its nuclear tests. So this is where you see that peaceful, smiling Buddha, peaceful nuclear explosion, all of those nicely packaged terminologies being used for extremely ultra realistic end goals that India has used. Now, coming back to the concept of the second point that we were talking about, the strategy and the tactics. Now, what is the strategy that India has used? And I would, although our focus does remain on the Modi government, because what Modi government has done is a very glaring and blatant and arrogant display of its subvertive activities. They do it and they feel proud about it, and they arrogantly flash it around. So this is how base they can get about it. But at the same time, as we all know, because it's a very learned audience, we are all very much familiar that India's subvertive activities do not just go back to two governments of Modi. India has been doing what it has done forever and forever. It started doing what activities it could do to sabotage, to subvert Pakistan as early as the creation of the state of Pakistan. Stopping of river waters flow, Sardar Patel's idea of not allowing water bodies to enter into Pakistan, which was Pakistan's right as a lower riparian state, was one of the first subvertive activities of its kind. They tried doing it, they could not do it. Better sense prevailed. Pakistan negotiated, and at the end of the day, the Indus Water Treaty came about. What India is doing to the Indus Water Treaty is yet another example of how India is using an international framework, mutually agreed framework, to its advantage, and gradually using this particular treaty or this particular card to, in the longer term, starve Pakistan from the river waters flow. Now, whenever Pakistan makes a legitimate claim in any of the international bodies about India's violation of the treaty clauses, India always comes up with this very convenient mantra that Pakistan has a problem of water management rather than water regulation or water flow entering into Pakistan. We have also seen that at the peak of the monsoon season, whenever India feels, they have released without much warning river waters into Pakistan, flooding the Punjab plains, and even to such a point that those areas in Pakistan which have always remained arid, which have always not or not been, they have remained very deserted, they were also flooded by water because the river waters overflew their capacity, submerging a lot of land, people, property, livestock in its wake, and causing immense economic loss to the state of Pakistan, which already is a fragile economy that one has to look at. So if we come back to the Modi government, the type of strategy the Modi government, or the strategy document, if you want to use that, let's talk about what type of a strategy document India is using for its subvertive activities. I would use two, three documents as a reference point. Number one, of course, is the Joint Defense Doctrine that India came up with, and they talked about how India is going to change its way of operating with its neighbors, and one main neighbor, aka Pakistan. A second aspect is India is going to be on the offensive rather than on the defensive. It is going to be aggressive rather than pacifist. It is going to make sure that people know it leaves a calling card for everyone to see. And that calling card is going to be a very aggressive calling card. It's not going to be the Gandhian, Ahimsa based, politely worded, nicely packaged, shiny calling card, so to speak. The second, of course, is its military doctrines that it has unfolded, which are now harboring on the offensive. Third, of course, part of the military doctrine is the strategic doctrine, the Indian nuclear doctrine that we talk about. And that also is a very carefully crafted, mixed tone doctrine, where India says that we believe in no first use, and the entire world pats them on their back for being such nice people, that they are not into the first use of nuclear weapons. But very immediately, the next clause to that says, however, India reserves the right to preemptively use its nuclear weapons or WMDs in condition A, B, C to endless possibilities. So it is how they have crafted the word, how they are using narrative, how they are using the discourse at their disposal to convince an audience that we were talking earlier about, the target audience here is the Western target audience. It is also the target audience that sits in the Indian state, the common people in India. It's also a target audience which is not much educated, that sits in Pakistan. Simple people who believe whatever people say on face value, people who access social media, who do not go into the depth of the situation, and they end up believing what is provided to them. Secondly, and lastly, in the strategy doctrines that India has, I think any of these doctrines don't matter as much as the two manifestos that the BJP unfolded in 2014 and 2019 elections that take precedence over all the other documents that India has. Walid, do I have time? How much time do I have at disposal?
You can continue. You take all the time that you need.
Thank you so much. Just flash me, because being a teacher, I can speak endlessly. So please just. Thank you so much. Okay, now what are the tactics that India has at hand? If you're looking at the Indian tactics at the political level, we would come across this particular factor that India has used foreign policy as a very pertinent tool of its subversion. India has used the soil of Afghanistan to carry out subvertive activities against Pakistan, whether in the guise of active consulates or in the guise of INGOs, regional NGOs, academics, or one could say civil society activists who are going there as volunteers, quote unquote, to carry out what they need to do. India at the governmental level has also been working with the Afghan government and doing active intelligence and planting intelligence reports against Pakistan. It is using the Afghans, it is using the Pakistanis against Afghanistan and Pakistan both, respectively, and carrying out subvertive activities, terrorist activities, militant activities, insurgent activities. And for that matter, the BLA is a very, very active case in point. Secondly, if we look at, we go back a little bit in history, the type of politics and the type of violence that the city, the main financial backbone of Pakistan, Karachi, the only port city of Pakistan, had faced during the 1980s and 1990s, was also because of the money and the political support that India gave to one particular ethnic party and used what it did. If we go further back into history, creation of the state of Bangladesh, in which where Pakistan made a lot of, unfortunately, costly mistakes, India used no bars. It had no, it did not hesitate at any point to exploit whatever fissures that it could do in that capacity. And they nurtured, they came up with militias that worked against the state of Pakistan and that helped in the creation of the state of Bangladesh. Fortunately for Bangladesh, they were sensible and they did not fall back into the fold of India as India was at that time perceiving, but it did not happen the way it was supposed to. But Karen used a very interesting analogy, and that was of the Nazis. And while I was preparing for this particular presentation, I came across Joseph Goebbels, who was the propaganda minister under Hitler, who said, "Lie so much and so often that it sounds like the truth." And that is precisely what India has done. Whether it be the Delhi riots, whether it be the Gujarat riot, whether it be love jihad against the Muslims, whether it be staged encounters in which only the Muslims are killed, whether it be Kashmir, whether it be Amarnath Yatra and killing of innocent Kashmiris, Article 370, creating of the new map, it's a huge list. Creation of the National Citizens Register, which is very one-sided, having the triple talaq, All of these factors, the Citizenship Amendment Act, all of them have again been packaged very well, and the lie has been repeated so much and so often that people start believing. Now, coming to that particular point of the target audience, the target audience in this capacity, if you're looking at the internal audience, the Indian internal audience, yes, they are believing many of the lies that Modi and his saffron brigade are making. People such as Ram Madhav, people such as Swami Anandanathan, and all of these characters. My apologies if I do not take these names properly. They are doing what they have been trained to do: indoctrinate, make people believe the lie, live the lie, breathe the lie, and it will work. Using of Bollywood as a very, very active tool of BJP agenda, and they dare not say anything that does not go in the right flavor of the government. Use of the traditional media, the print media, the electronic media, and now the social media amply proves what it is. India, by virtue of the good luck that India has, that it has adequate finances, and by virtue of those finances, India has very prudently invested in the right quarters, global media, lobbyist groups. And those are the target groups which are doing India's job for them within the state and outside the state. And as a result of that, the narrative, the discourse that is developing is very pro India, in that sense that whatever they say, any human rights violation, anything is not taken seriously. It is not for the first time that a dossier has been prepared by the Pakistani government, a credible dossier, which is using credible, real evidence provided to the international audience. A similar attempt was carried out 5 years back as well. What happened? It was given to the United Nations. 3 dossiers were prepared. They were given to the United Nations. They were also given to the American administration. Nothing happened. Because, as I said earlier, the world requires Indian money. India has its lobbyists who are in cahoots with the Israeli lobbyist. And this is the triangular connection that the latest dossier comes up with, the CIA, Mossad, and the raw nexus that it is. They are all working together to come up with this factor. Not only is the economic subversion taking place, FATF is also an expression of India's subvertive activities of maligning Pakistan, taking away the labor market in Middle East, Saudi Arabia, and other places which were the revenue, external revenue baskets for Pakistan, is yet another example of very well staged and well mannered subvertive activity in terms of economic subversion. And then using the legal parameters, discarding the legal parameters, twisting them, staying out of several international law frameworks that may bind them to certain agreements, and willfully, arrogantly violating them is also part of this subvertive activity. So, what I would like to, because I think I have taken a lot of time, what I would like to lastly point out is that in part of the audience that we were talking about, from the international audience, the Western audience, to the regional audience, coming to China, to Central Asia, to the region around us, the SAARC region, where SAARC has become ineffective, Afghanistan, to extra-regional powers, Iran, Middle East, and so many other countries that surround us, and even within Pakistan, where people usually take things on the face value without getting into the depth and details of the things. What we need to see is how we react or how we respond to these target audience at these various levels. There is always some fissure which our adversary would exploit. So we need to fill those gaps. Our strength lies in our economic consolidation, sustainability, and build up. If we are not economically consolidated, if we are not economically sound, unfortunately, we would keep on having these extra influences, subvertive influences, we need to also work very hard in winning the hearts of people rather than minds of people. Minds can always be won. Minds need to be independent. People need to think out of the box. People need to have different thoughts, but their hearts need to be with the country. They need to be united on the common platform. And I think if we do that bit, if we all work together as a common nation without making artificial attempts to do that, I think we would definitely be able to counter India's subvertive activities. And I would end on this point that it is not a myth, it is definitely a reality. And there are too many evidences to prove that this is not a myth, but a reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Salma. Dr. Ambassador Asif Durrani, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Walid. Am I audible?
Perfectly audible, sir.
Thank you, Walid. Brigadier Janjua has already set the tone of today's discussion. And after hearing excellent presentations from Karen Fisher and Dr. Salma Malik, I think very little has been left to talk about. However, my 2 cents contribution would be that the title itself, when we talk about India's subversive tactics in Pakistan, and the myth of Ahimsa, which has been exposed, or gradually it has been exposed, need to be looked into a little bit much deeper. As Dr. Salma Malik has also pointed out regarding the concept of Ahimsa, which believed in non-violence, which believed in peaceful struggle, and to which there has been a body of support, not only in India, but Mr. Gandhi also became an icon to follow on the concept of peaceful struggle and non-violent struggle. That has been there, and it did actually boosted India as a secular polity, as the largest democracy in the world. And then there are many other laurels India has won over the years. It is the second largest in the world as far as population is concerned, and the largest army, as well as largest, third largest economy. But the problem is that where India is situated, its neighbors are not happy. It is just not the case with Pakistan, that Pakistan is the culprit. Sri Lanka is not happy, Nepal is not happy, Bhutan has been strangulated, Maldives, our tiny Maldives is strangulated. Bangladesh has been almost strangulated, and the latest episode on Citizens Register, NRC, has actually also broken the myth of so-called friendship between India and Bangladesh. So there are so many myths, if we step by step go, those have been broken. India's claim to be a Hindu state, a Hindutva state, has further been broken with Nepal when it tried to be expansionist and gobble up the Nepalese territory more recently, and Nepal had to protest. Nepal has been facing frequent blockades, latest being in 2015. So that has been the fate of Nepal being landlocked. Bangladesh has been facing those such blockades. It's from three quarters, from three sides, it has been surrounded by India. It did try to become friendly. It did try to toe the Indian line, but ultimately, the latest episode with 1.9 million Bengalis have been delisted, and they have deregistered, and they are becoming stateless citizens, is a big jolt to the Bangladeshi efforts to have friendly relations with them. With Pakistan, when you talk about is then we have faced bullying from the very beginning. Strangulation tactics, whether on division of assets or demarcation of boundaries, had been there. We have a perennial dispute with India, there's no doubt about it. So, but when you talk about Sri Lanka, our neighbors, other neighbors, look at it that India's myth as an Ahimsa Wadi country, or a country of which believed in the philosophy of non-violence, actually created terrorists. It is India which created terrorists in the former East Pakistan through Mukti Bahini. It was India which created terrorists in the form of LTTE. And when LTTE is Supremo Prabhakaran, and then Rajiv Gandhi went in 1987 to sign the so-called peace accord, he had confined Prabhakaran in Ashoka Hotel, New Delhi, and landed in Sri Lanka and signed the so-called peace accord with President Jayawardene. But on coming back, while reviewing the Guard of Honor, he was hit by the Sri Lankan soldier just to express the hatred and abhorrence of Indian bullying. So this is what it happened. So in that context, I just wanted to list out that how India itself had created those monsters, which LTT ultimately took you can say the Rajiv Gandhi. LTT was created by Indira Gandhi, but her son, who had pushed for this accord, actually had to lose his life. And then he had to lose his life because of the monster it itself had created in the form of LTT. So here, what I'm trying to say is that on one hand, we have Ahimsa philosophy, but on the other hand, in actual practice, India has been a practicing terror factory or practicing terror hub in first bullying its neighbors in order to create its hegemony so that it can dictate the terms. That's why when we talk about South Asia or the SAARC region where it could not take off was because of the bullying tactics. Look at ASEAN, where the largest country is Indonesia, but Indonesia gave up so many things, so many disputes it had with the neighbors, and it had to display the large-heartedness, and that's how ASEAN became our success story. So here, what I'm trying to establish further is with regard to Ahimsa and with regard to terrorist tactics is that they cannot go together, Ahimsa and terrorist tactics. They cannot claim, they cannot run with the hare and hunt with the hound when it comes to actual bilateral relations are concerned. So what dossier we on the 14th of November, Pakistan had to present was not something new. In fact, it was in continuation of the previous evidences Pakistan has been collecting and presenting to the world. But at the same time, it is reinforcing the view not only in Pakistan, but gradually it will gain grounds elsewhere in the world, would be that somehow that country which pleaded for so-called democracy and human rights and all that, itself is actually the practitioner of terrorism. Now, mind you, when we talk about terrorism now, it is after the 9/11, somehow, unfortunately, it has become fashionable that those countries which want to bully, they in fact use and liberally use the term terrorism. I mean, ignoring the fact that since early 90s, this issue of terrorism is stuck in the United Nations because of the definition of terrorism. Because the UN Charter makes a distinction between normal violence and the violence aimed at getting right to self-determination. Under Article 2 of the UN Charter, it is very much clear. So therefore, it is important that we also make a distinction. But after the 9/11, somehow, once what happened, so whatever United States wanted to say and wanted to do, they could achieve that. And in that garb, India also got away with whatever it wanted to say with regard to so-called terrorism. What is happening in the Indian illegally occupied Kashmir is a freedom struggle. It is not new. It is 7 decades old. It is the struggle where more than 100,000 Kashmiris have laid down their lives. India tried to equate that freedom struggle as terrorism and thrust the blame on Pakistan. But it has not taken off. It has not worked for India. India did try to isolate Pakistan. It failed. It did try to isolate Pakistan by boycotting the SAARC summit in 2016. It failed. The reason was that within a couple of months' time, Pakistan hosted the Economic Cooperation Organization Summit with 10 members, and the most successful eco summit we ever had. So the question is, here we have to be clear that why India wants to use these tactics, which Pakistan through its dossier has tried to expose. First, India has already created a new normal with regard to its relations with Pakistan after it intruded into Balakot and violated the sovereignty of Pakistan. And it is now we are grappling with a situation under the nuclear overhang, which is very dangerous. Secondly, India has been using FATF to malign Pakistan. It's a forum which now, I think, after Pakistan has been able to submit those evidences with regard to the transactions which have been taking place through India to the subversive elements in TTP as well as subnational groups in Balochistan. So I think it should now should register and should become a permanent agenda item in the FATF future interactions. Under this FATF rubric, I think India cannot get away with what it did through its subversive activities in Pakistan when Pakistan got hold of its serving raw agent Kulbhushan Yadav in Balochistan. So, and he himself has admitted conducting death and destruction activities in Balochistan and in Karachi. So, in that respect, I think that is concrete evidence which Pakistan has got. Secondly, on its support to TTP, and that too through the travel belt has been quite an embarrassment for the Indians, and I think now they cannot get away with that. And it has also proven, this dossier has proven that India has been running almost 87 terrorist camps, 66 in Afghanistan and 21 in India. Excuse me. So, and then India has also been using third countries to use sabotage as a tool. Why? Now, the overall picture which is emerging, especially after what India did on 8th of August, the 5th of August last year, by reoccupying the illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, actually, India did not realize that what they have, in fact, disturbed the hornet's nest. The maps which India issued, and which showed, which gobbled up all the occupied territories, and also showed Aksai Chin as part of India, in fact, created now two-front situation for India. Not only Pakistan, but China is also now has become an active party. And what we see is this military standoff, and that has also contributed to more tensions in the region. Now it is a threesome game between Pakistan, India, and China, and how it is going to unfold is yet to be seen. But related to that is the Indian activities to sabotage the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor CPEC projects, and they have created a dedicated cell in the Indian Intelligence Agency Research and Analysis Wing RAW, which with the huge budget and subversive activities, almost 700 people have reportedly been trained, and they are likely to conduct sabotage activities in Balochistan and elsewhere in the country. So that is a worrisome question, and that need to be, and I think this dossier is going to expose India on that. The question is why India is doing, why it has been doing that. Prima facie and foremost is being that India wants to pressurize Pakistan to abandon its stance on Kashmir, which is, of course, is unthinkable. But at the same time, India has been applying these tactics. Its second aspect of this whole exercise and tactics in subversion is playing the role of a spoiler in Afghanistan's peace process. And here you can see the deeper linkages between the Afghan intelligence agency NDS and Indian intelligence agency RAW, that they have been jointly conducting those operations, especially by Afghan side, allowing India to have a free hand in running the training camps, in having meetings with the subversive elements in Balochistan, as well as the TTP people who are taking shelter in Afghanistan. And thirdly, India, with the Hindutva majoritarian dispensation in power in India since 2014, they are trying to create a fear psychosis in the country. The purpose is to crush the minorities who are already, actually, they are at the receiving end, whether even before BJP could win the elections. And then now, since the RSS, which is the mother organization of the Sangh Parivar, it is dictating all the time. And the foremost principle of the Sangh Parivar, especially the RSS, is the hate minorities, especially the Muslims. They are taking the revenge of the previous centuries now with the minorities, especially the Muslims. As if in the previous centuries, everything was hunky-dory and it was a democratic order. So somehow bizarre explanations are being given, and new standards are being set on in teaching the political science to the world. So in that respect, they want to push in the people in such a manner that they will have no place, but they will try to leave the country. And definitely in that case, then you will find Pakistan would be under pressure, because there are over 200 million Muslims living in India. So that should be a source of concern to all in Pakistan, as well as in elsewhere in the world, and that needs to be looked into. So the overall cumulative impact of Indian hybrid warfare, as well as subversive activities, has created a very explosive situation. You find along the line of control, almost 4,700 violations India has conducted from the start of this year. Forget about the last year, which were also almost although less, still those were there close to 3,000. So if you compare, so this year it has become more lethal, more serious, and more civilian people have been killed on the Azad Kashmir side. What are the options in this whole scenario when Pakistan has given the dossier to the world and it is going to contest the Indian subversive activities at the international fora with the capitals of the world. I'm afraid options are very limited. Reason being that the situation which has emerged over the years, especially after the 5th August last year, India's action in the illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, this a slightest miscalculation may have disastrous consequences. Not only for India and Pakistan, but for the entire region and the world at large. So in that respect, it requires the international community's intercession to address the situation before it can get out of control. Secondly, now FATF and UN Security Council's 1267 committee, which deals with terrorism, it has to activate itself and then look at their surroundings. And those countries which claim to be the champions of democracy, like India, that what are they doing, what they have been doing, and what has been their record with regard to human rights, with regard to terrorist financing, and how they have contributed in containing the terrorism. In fact, they are instrumental in fanning those terrorist activities and causing death and destruction. In Pakistan, as the dossier itself says, that there have been more than 13,000 terrorist attacks, of which India also has got a substantive share, and that should not be forgotten. So I should end here, but with a note, with a serious note, that situation is very precarious, very serious, and it needs to be tackled. And it is not only at the regional, but at the international level. And time has come that India should be counseled, that it just cannot have the cake and eat it too. I thank you. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, sir, and thank you to all our speakers for consenting to speak at such a short notice. We will now formally commence with the question and answer session. The first question has been asked by Mr. Ali Nasir, and it is being addressed to Ms. Karen Fisher. Mr. Nasir would want to know how the rise of the All India Majlis-e-Ittihadul Muslimin is reflective, and whether it is reflective of a shift in India's politics in the wake of the BJP and the RSS Hindutva rule forcing Muslims to seek their own political space.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Ms. Karen.
Unfortunately, I've been gone long enough to not really be tuned in to these kind of internal dynamics politically at the moment. In the past, OIC has been accused of being the B team of the BJP, trying to get the vote that the Congress would have gotten from minorities and being promoted by the BJP. I don't know if he has emerged since as his own independent force, and if he is more worried about protecting the rights of the Muslims as a whole instead of just projecting his own political career. I don't know, but I don't see much hope in terms of political mobilization of Muslims inside India, effective mobilization through a political party or otherwise, because Muslims are horribly divided, and there's clear leadership lacking on the grassroots level. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Ms. Karen. The next question that we have is from Ms. Hajra Sajjad, and is being addressed to Dr. Salma. Ms. Hajra would want to know whether the Indian subversive activities in the Balochistan and Fata region would still be a reality if Pakistani state hadn't left these regions deprived. Dr. Salma.
Right. Thank you, Willie. Thank you, Hajra. I totally agree with you that the adversary always looks at the fractures, and this is something that I had highlighted in the presentation as well, that they look at your weak points and they exploit them. However, I would say that if we take this aspect out of Balochistan or FATA and we look at Karachi, then Karachi was not as deprived as Balochistan or FATA are. And FATA's and Balochistan's dynamics and case studies, apparently they may have some certain similarities. I must put this point across that they have some very outstanding differences that cannot put or club them together. However, if I may say that in comparison, if you look at what happened in Karachi during the 80s and the 90s, and how the MQM was used by India and the ethnic card, the same ethnic card that India is now using to squash the Muslim population, that ethnic card was used to destabilize Pakistan, is an example where you can kind of engineer a diversionary, subvertive activity and do what you need to do. But I could not agree with you more that the onus of the responsibility lies with us. We need to see to it that we don't have any cracks that our adversary can exploit and use to its advantage and to our disadvantage. Thank you.
Ma'am, in fact, there's another question directed to you by Mr. Ali Nasir, who would want to...
In comparison to Vajpayee?
Absolutely, ma'am, absolutely.
Okay.
Would you like to take that question?
Sure. I would say that in certain senses, Vajpayee and Modi's policies may not be different. But I think Ambassador Durrani, given his experience in the Foreign Service and coming in touch with these people personally, may actually be even better qualified to respond to this. But when I look at Prime Minister Vajpayee's long political career, coming from Bajrang Dal, a staunch Bajrang Bali, a Hanuman worshipper. So he had all the right resume when it came to the right wing Shiv Senaks or these sevaks, car sevaks that we have. But what Vajpayee saw in his long years in establishment and Indian politics was how these subvertive activities, how these damaging politics do not have much dividend to pay. And this is my very, very personal opinion. And that is why we see Vajpayee emerging towards the end of his political career as a very different political actor. But please also do keep in mind that on certain decisions, even within India or outside, he was extremely focused and rigid when it came to that. The difference in both of these persons are that Modi is not only arrogant, he blatantly indulges into human rights violations, crimes against humanity, and gets away with it. And as far as the Akhand Bharat concept is there, I may also tell you, Ali, that this is a concept which, even if the Indian National Congress or the Congress Eye of India does not talk about very openly, and the right wingers talk more openly about Akhand Bharat, because that is part of the Kurukshetra and the Mahabharat doctrine and the philosophy and those old mythologies that they believe in. Congress also smarted under the notion that Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, bifurcated the Gau Mata, the Mother India. And when 1971 happened and Bangladesh was created, you may recall Indira Gandhi's famous words that today I have sought the revenge of 1,000 years. Right? So these things remain in the hearts of all of those Indian leaders, but some have been more vocal about it and some have been less. Thank you. Waleed, your mic is muted. We cannot hear you.
Apologies, ma'am. I've unmuted it now. The next question has been addressed to Ambassador Asif Durrani. It has been asked by Mr. Hamza Rifat. Mr. Hamza would want to know what Pakistan's diplomatic options will be in light of revelations in the dossier presented a few days ago.
Well, we are facing with the difficult choices, and as I said in my concluding remarks, that our options are quite limited, but at the same time, those are the options which in any case we have to exercise, and one of them is the counseling at the international fora, which I think we are doing. At times the results are frustrating, but nevertheless, we have to exhaust those options. Peaceful options are always frustrating to come by, but at the same time, those are worth exploring, because if we don't do that, then I think war becomes, you can say, inevitable. So all exercise these efforts, diplomatic efforts, are made to avert the war, and especially in a scenario where both the countries are nuclear powers. And that is the reason that at the international level, while India has tried to get away with because of its economic clout, still concerns are being expressed on the evolving situation. So I think we don't have to be disappointed, and we have to continue to hammer those options which are peaceful, but at the same time which can also counsel India to see the reason and then live like a peaceful neighbor. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Asif. That formally brings us to the end of the question and answer session as well. We did have other questions, but those have been addressed by the speakers during their presentations. I would now like to offer Brigadier Rashid Wali-Janjua the floor for his concluding remarks.
Thank you, Waleed. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're perfectly audible.
So I warmly thank all the three participants for a very enlightening discourse. And I think at the end of the seminar, we are very clear about certain things, that the destabilization tactics, those have been let loose upon Pakistan, are not a one-off phenomena, but a part of a sedulous policy and a well thought out strategic attempt to outflank Pakistan and to isolate it, with the purpose to completely dominate a region where India thinks itself part of a strategic culture that looks at regional connectivity and China-Pakistan economic corridor as a threat to its own core interests. So instead of creating an environment of cooperative engagement, complete destabilization regime has been let loose upon our region. Creation of militias, funding them generously, ratcheting up tensions, culling all economic initiatives. If this is the strategy and the end objectives are to keep a region completely destabilized so that Pakistan and another emerging global power, China, do not reap the full dividends of economic engagement, and regional connectivity, all in the service of a global power, which is trying to make South Asia as an arena for their own strategic conflicts. One of the examples is that the entire world is looking askance at a very important development, that is the ASEAN and RCEP initiative, in which what countries like Australia, South Korea, and New Zealand even has come on board. But India stayed out, and there are voices from within the same community inside India against that economically, unviable policy. But still, India is latching on to strategic congruence and strategic relationship with a transatlantic power, ignoring the regional realities, actively, ratcheting up the tensions, keeping Afghanistan on the boil, and doing all that is possible through actively creating militias in Balochistan. As Ambassador Durrani mentioned, 500 persons militia has been created, led by 24 leaders and managed by the serving officers of RAW, out to destabilize Pakistan, and dissidents and disaffected elements, which would always be there in any country, have been, corralled together, generously funded, and are being actively encouraged. And it's a sure recipe for disaster for regional peace. And the world community has to get up and take notice. And it is for us and our own diplomatic exertions to ensure that the best is done and the international community takes cognizance of these realities. So with these concluding words, I thank once again the three participants and all those who joined us in this webinar. Thank you, Willie.
Thank you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to an end to today's webinar titled Indian Subversive Tactics in Pakistan, the Myth of Ahimsa Exposed. I extend my gratitude to all our speakers and attendees who joined us for this event. And please make sure to follow IPRI on its social media accounts for updates on events, publications, and research work. I thank you all once again for your participation, and Allah Hafiz.